here's the problem with chasing a number. We convince ourselves that once we hit it, everything will finally make sense. If I just reach that salary, that portfolio size, that magic number. But spoiler alert, numbers don't create meaning. They only buy the possibility of it. Enough isn't the finish line. Enough is the moment the real questions begin. You've built the career, you're building the portfolio, you're close to freedom. So what now? Welcome to Life After Enough. Money, meaning, and the life you design when work becomes optional. I'm Nick. I'm racing towards early retirement and figuring out who I become when the job no longer dictates what I do with my time. Let's get into it. I think as a society, we tend to think about enough as a purely financial metric, a kind of spreadsheet victory, reaching a certain net worth you've been aspiring to, obtaining a salary goal with your next promotion at work, even paying off your primary residence early. And there's a logic to this, of course. After all, most people spend their entire lives focused on financial enough. It's necessary and foundational. I'm talking about myself as well. Early on in my career, I was obsessed with climbing the corporate ladder as quickly as possible in order to get the salary bump and the recognition to outwardly demonstrate success. But what people couldn't see was that approach made me pretty miserable. I'd end up spending more on holidays and escapism to distract myself from the drudgery and responsibility of corporate life. Even later on, when I discovered the FIRE, or Financial Independence Retire Early movement, money again became my focus, and it was my North Star to the exclusion of anything else. When your focus is only on financial goals, you end up neglecting the other pillars of enough, which are equally, if not more important. I want to pause here and recognize what a privilege it is to even have this conversation. To be able to think beyond financial security and look at the other forms of enough. I don't take that for granted for a second. So along with financial enough, what are the other pillars? In my eyes, it's both emotional enough and also identity enough. And in this episode, we're going to look at each one of these pillars in turn to help reframe what enough is, from it being a purely financial milestone and instead to being a multidimensional life concept that includes all three pillars. The key takeaway, most relevant to me personally, and hopefully to the wider audience, is that financial independence is amazing and foundational, but it's not the whole story. With that in mind, let's jump to each pillar in more detail, starting with financial enough. I'm a bit of an all or nothing kind of guy. I definitely have an obsessive streak. My husband and close friends will happily confirm that. The upside of that, though, is my superpower, hyperfocus. When I believe in something or have a goal, I'll move heaven and earth to make it happen. And that's exactly what happened when I discovered the Financial Independence Retire Early, or FIRE, movement during the COVID lockdowns back in 2020. For those of you that don't know, in a nutshell, the FIRE movement is built on a very simple idea. If you can save and invest enough that your money starts working harder than you do, you eventually gain the freedom to choose how you spend your time, i.e., you become work optional. At its core, FIRE rests on a few key principles. 1. Spend less than you earn. 2. Invest the difference. And 3. Know your financial enough. We'll do a proper deep dive on all things FIRE in a later episode, but this gives you enough context for now. Once I stumbled on FIRE, I fell completely down the rabbit hole. I devoured everything I could find. Books, blogs, YouTube videos, podcasts. It felt like I discovered the ultimate hack, the antidote to a lifetime on the corporate treadmill without having to live like a hermit in a tent. And honestly, it gave me something I didn't even realize I was missing: purpose and direction. It was the middle of the pandemic, everything felt uncertain, and suddenly this idea appeared: a roadmap that promised freedom, control, and the ability to design life on my own terms. For the first time in my adult life, I could see a path to independence that didn't involve waiting until 65 to start living the life I actually wanted. I had a plan. I had spreadsheets. I had conviction. And because I'm an all or nothing kind of person, I reorganized my entire life around it. I went back into corporate work. I optimized everything. and I set my sights on the number, my financial enough. When you're laser focused on this first pillar of enough, the financial one, it's so easy to reduce everything else to a target number, a withdrawal rate, and an early retirement date. It's neat, it's tidy, it's logical. It speaks to my crazy hyper-focused brain. Financial security is incredible, don't get me wrong. It removes fear, it creates choices, it gives you breathing room to imagine other possibilities. But it's also seductive because it makes you believe in a really simple equation. Money equals freedom. Freedom equals happiness. The end. But of course, life isn't an Excel formula. It's easy to convince yourself that money is the only piece that matters, that once you're free, once you've bought your time back, you'll be perfectly content spending your days playing tennis, baking bread, walking the dog, and posting smug photos of it online. You tell yourself that you'll then figure it all out. The identity, the purpose, the big life questions. But here's the uncomfortable truth that I've realized. The other big stuff doesn't wait patiently for you to reach financial enough. If you feel lost or restless or disconnected while you're grinding towards freedom, you'll still carry those same feelings right into early retirement. Financial enough changes your circumstances, but does nothing to your soul. And if you haven't built those other pillars, emotional enough and identity enough, along the way, then all that time and freedom you've bought can start to feel kind of empty. I think of it this way. Fire gives you the keys to a door, but if you haven't done the inner work, you might walk through that door and realize you have no idea where you actually want to go next. In 2024, I reached my original fire number. It was a huge milestone, the thing I've been working towards for 5 years, the thing I'd built my routines and sacrifices around. And for a while, it did feel amazing. I had this internal soundtrack playing, a sort of, you did it montage, yay! But then my brain, in its usual unhelpful way, piped up with, right, Nick, what's next? And that's when the shine dulled, because I was still stressed. I was still tired. I still wasn't really taking proper care of myself. And if I was honest, I was definitely still not sure where my life was going. Financial enough removes the fear of survival, but it can't answer this basic question. What do you actually want your life to be? And that's why the other pillars matter. You can't outsource meaning to the future. You have to build it alongside your balance sheet. The same intensity, the same energy, the same spreadsheet level hyper-focus you use on your finances also needs to go into your emotional well-being and sense of identity as well. Because once the money part is solved, the real work is figuring out what living actually looks like. That starts with feeling emotionally enough, safe enough, calm enough, present enough to actually enjoy the freedom you've worked so hard for. So looking at pillar 2, emotional enough. I think of this as the invisible foundation, but also it's largely the one we tend to ignore when we're busy chasing the number and grinding at work. You can be financially secure, but emotionally just running on fumes. Emotional enough is the point where you stop living in permanent survival mode, where you don't make every decision from panic, scarcity, or comparison. It's not about being happy all the time, although that would be lovely. It's about feeling safe enough to breathe. It looks like not living in fear of losing everything, making decisions from a calm place, not from crisis, having the headspace to want things again, and feeling safe enough to actually rest. It sounds super simple, but it's incredibly rare. The truth is, most of us spend years building a financial and physical sense of security that we never actually feel. The numbers on the spreadsheets don't translate into real life impact. I used to think that once I'd hit my fire number, I'd actually be able to relax. But instead, I found myself just upgrading my anxieties. I wasn't worrying about bills anymore. I was worrying about interest rates or withdrawal rates or market crashes. And of course, the existential risk of thinking I'm going to run out of money at age 78 and having to live off cat food. quick pause. If you're enjoying this conversation and it's making you rethink what your own enough looks like, please do me a favor. Hit follow on your podcast app and share this episode with someone who'd love it too. It really helps the show to grow. Thank you. In 2025, I decided to take a 6-month sabbatical from work. I got married to the love of my life. We had an incredible and painfully expensive honeymoon to Hawaii. I traveled, I reconnected with friends, and I finally had space to breathe after years of structure and spreadsheets. But quietly, underneath all the celebrations and travel plans, I had another motive. I wanted to see what life beyond work might actually feel like once the noise stopped. Once the euphoria of the sabbatical wore off, would I still be happy? Would I be content? Or, and this was the one that scared me, would I just feel bored and a bit lost? And that brings me to where I learned something uncomfortable. For the first time in my adult life, I had real space. I wasn't chained to a schedule, no deadlines, no meetings, no endless Teams pings. The pressure was off. But outside the excitement of the wedding and the honeymoon, I felt untethered. I'd always imagined that freedom would be fulfilling, that once I had control of my time, joy would just arrive like an Amazon delivery. But instead, it was oddly disorienting. My calendar was empty, and so, if I'm honest, was my sense of purpose. It was a really strange realization. I'd spent years building financial safety, but I hadn't really put any effort into building emotional safety. Because freedom, as I learned, isn't the absence of pressure, but it is the presence of peace. You can have all the time in the world, but if your mind is still wired for scarcity, if you still feel like you have to earn your right to rest, you'll just rebuild the same cage, but only this time with a nicer view. Emotional enough isn't something that just happens once you've made it. It's something you have to nurture whilst you're getting there. If you don't build peace alongside wealth, you'll hit your goals and realize you've built a beautiful life that you're too anxious to enjoy. And that's why emotional enough matters. It's the invisible foundation that lets freedom actually feel free. And like everything worthwhile, it's not something you hit just once. It's something that you need to practice. And for me, that's been learning to stop optimizing every moment of my life and just sit in it. Not trying to monetize hobbies, not trying to justify a slow morning, just being. Money can buy you time, but it can't tell you how to fill it. And now, with that in mind, looking at pillar 3, identity enough. Who you get to become next. This is the deepest layer, and honestly, the one I've avoided the longest. When you stop benchmarking your life by promotions and LinkedIn applause, performance reviews and salary bumps, you're left with a deeply inconvenient question. Who am I when I'm not climbing? For a long time, I knew exactly what I was running from: the pressure, the politics, the performance reviews, the whole conveyor belt of corporate life. It's easy to build an identity around escaping that, to say, this is what I don't want. And in the FIRE space, or even among people feeling stuck at work, I think it's really common that that's the story. That's the narrative we say. We rally around what we're leaving, the long hours, the meaningless meetings, the Sunday dread. We create something to hate on because that in itself gives us direction. It gives us momentum. But that is just a push. And what we're dying for is to have a pull. You can't build a fulfilling life on resistance alone. At some point, you do have to ask, what's pulling me forward? What am I actually running towards? And that's a much harder question because it requires imagination rather than frustration. It's also something I've really struggled with throughout my adult life. For years, my motivation came from running away from things, whether that's a bad boss, a toxic work culture, or just a general feeling that I was meant for something else, rather than running towards something I'd clearly defined. Only now am I starting to unpack what might come next. You have to stop proving a point and start building a purpose. That's where many of us, myself included, get stuck. Because when the noise of ambition and obligation finally fades, the silence that follows can be deafening. But, thankfully, that's also where the magic begins. In that silence, you finally have the space to hear what's been whispering underneath all along. For me, that was, do you want to be a parent? How can I put skills to good use to help people in need? Should I start another business? Where do I actually want to call home? And what kind of person do I want to be when no one's paying me to be productive? Those questions sound so exciting, but they're also terrifying because there's no spreadsheet for them. There's no podcast episode that gives you the exact formula. When you've been grinding for years to reach financial enough, it's incredibly hard just to flick a switch and suddenly build an identity that isn't connected to earning or achieving. For so long, every part of life revolves around the next promotion or pay rise or step up the corporate ladder. It just becomes second nature. The way you measure progress or purpose or even self-worth is all tied up in the same thing. So when that structure disappears, it's disorienting. Of course, you can absolutely keep working if you love what you do. Plenty of people in the FIRE community do exactly that. But for those of us who don't and who want something different, it almost can feel strangely familiar, like being back at school and someone asks, what do you want to do when you grow up? Except this time there's no right answer. And the job doesn't have to pay well or even at all. And it definitely doesn't need to be approved by your parents. And that's both the beauty and the chaos of this stage of life. The slate is clean, but so are all the expectations. If your sense of identity has always been tied to productivity or income, it can be deeply uncomfortable to realize that freedom doesn't automatically come with direction. We spend so long believing that once we have time, purpose will just simply appear, like it's been waiting patiently in the wings. But often the opposite happens. The structure of work disappears, and with it, the built-in validation that used to make us useful or important does too. In the worst cases, people end up drifting straight back to the very careers they were desperate to escape, not because they love the work, but because at least there, they know who they are. It's a familiar environment, even though it's not a fulfilling one. But that's the trap. Going back to what's known instead of doing the harder, slower work of building a new identity and meaning outside of that space. True freedom isn't just about having options. It's about having the courage to stop filling the silence with the same old noise. You have to build that part of yourself intentionally, just like you built the financial foundation. Because the goal isn't just to stop working for money, it's to start creating meaning on your own terms. That's the work of identity enough. The ongoing process of becoming someone who actually fits the life you've built. That's much harder than people realize. When anything is possible, nothing is obvious. And that's where fear can kind of sneak back in. Not the fear of failure, but the fear of choosing wrong. It's tempting just to rush in and fill the silence quickly. Start a business, move countries, find the next project that makes you feel productive again. But identity doesn't like to be rushed. It needs stillness. And if you've lived your whole life in achievement mode, stillness can feel like failure. The irony, of course, is that the same skills that got you to financial enough, patience, persistence, discipline, well, they're the same ones you need to reinvent yourself after it. Because identity enough isn't about who you were when you were chasing your goals. It's about who you get to become once you finally stop chasing. That's the real prize of freedom. Not doing nothing, but having the space and courage to become someone new. Okay, well, that episode got a little deeper than I originally had planned, but I hope you enjoyed it and I hope it made you think. If there's one thing to take away from today's episode, it's this. Enough isn't the finish line. It's actually just the beginning. It gives you the right to want things again, to try things again, to become someone again, and the freedom to start writing the next chapter with intention. The real work and joy comes from building the emotional and identity pillars alongside the financial one, so that when you're ready and finally have the time and space, you actually know how to fill it. And that's what this podcast is all about. Over the weeks ahead, we'll keep coming back to these themes: how to build a life that's not just financially independent, but emotionally fulfilled and purpose-driven too. We'll talk to people who've stepped off the treadmill, who've defined and redefined what enough looks like in their world, and who are honest about the messy middle between security and purpose. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that having enough money doesn't mean you have enough meaning. But it does give you the freedom and responsibility to go find it. Thanks for listening to Life After Enough, a podcast about money, meaning, and the life you design when work becomes optional. If this episode made you rethink your future, share it with someone who's starting to question the script too. You can follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Nick, and I'll see you next week as we keep building a life that's truly ours.